Speaking of sports, and you are, and now is the time to do sports.
Well, on Sundays, yes.
On Sundays, is this football?
Football is like that. Well, not as fast as it used to be, but nevertheless.
And, by the way, this goes a little outside of our conversation, but since we're talking about football, are you basically a team player? How important is the team in the work?
Well, one in the field is not a warrior. This is the name the president recently quoted in one of his conversations. But there is also a novel called One in the Field is a Warrior. And, of course, scouts, they very often perform individual tasks. Diplomats also have many situations when they have to act at their own risk, when there is no opportunity. To inquire about the leadership's position. There are such situations, yes.
Could you tell us about such a situation? Now, this is an interesting point. I've never heard of it.
1996 year. I am the representative to the UN, the American counterpart Madeleine Albright, who, by the way, allowed me to smoke in her residence, which was strictly prohibited under the laws of New York. And the Cubans shoot down an American plane that flew with provocative purposes from Miami, flew into the airspace of Cuba.
Американский самолет, который летел с провокационными целями из Майами, залетел в воздушное пространство Кубы.
The Americans are urgently convening the UN Security Council. It's 3 o'clock in the morning in Moscow. And I understand that it is necessary, of course, to show some flexibility, on the one hand, and on the other. Do not allow the text to be omitted, which will then be used to condemn the Cubans. I won't go into details now, I probably won't remember very well, but this text turned out to be adopted by consensus. And our Cuban friends still thank me for that night. Here is one example, probably the most striking.
Sorry, and then already clinging to the events at the UN. Tell me, please, at the time when you worked there, how much was the feeling of what I mainly mean, of course, the 94th, 95th, 96th years, how much was the feeling that the position of our leadership that you broadcast corresponds to your inner feeling of that how Russia should be represented in the international field?
Вы транслируете, отвечает вашему внутреннему ощущению от того, какой должна быть представлена Россия в международном поле.
On most issues, the position of the then Russian leadership was generally formulated in broad strokes, because on the agenda of the Security Council, there were mainly African problems, some Asian, Latin American, and the Caribbean. And our leadership at that time paid attention primarily to the Western vector, and the work on the Western vector was carried out primarily in the context of relations between the family group and Russia. Russia was invited back in the 94th year. Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin was invited to Naples, in my opinion. And the leadership was focused on creating conditions for deepening partnership with the West. As it turned out later, or rather, it turned out that it was fast enough, but, as almost all of our politicians and citizens could see later, the partnership was like a younger brother. And this role was assigned to us. It was, of course, a colossal mistake. Now many Western analysts write about this in their memoirs, that there was no point in expanding NATO. There was no point in keeping Russia on the margins. But now the goal of joining the family group was set. And, you know, even in the 2000s, we did not refuse to continue working in order to develop cooperation with the West. Yes, if we talk about the UN, then of course, the biggest discord in my memory during my work was the 99th year. when Belgrade was bombed without any discussion in the Security Council, and this gross violation of international law in general, and obligations within the framework of the security organization lasted for 78 days cooperation in Europe. And we must pay tribute to the fact that this adventure was categorically condemned by Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin. But it was already the 99th year when Igor Sergeyevich Ivanov was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Before him, after Kosovo, there was Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov, our great teacher. And starting with Primakov, of course, our foreign policy actions began to undergo changes in the direction of multipolarity, which was not yet so designated at that time, but which was then legalized in the diplomatic lexicon by Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov, already formally advocating the promotion of the interests of a multipolar world. This, in fact, you understand, there are many principles in the UN Charter. The West now sees only territorial integrity. There is the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. There is the principle of respect for human rights, including linguistic and religious rights. We are now drawing the attention of the West to how interesting the situation is when discussing any other problem. Venezuela, North Korea, Iran, of course, almost any country, including India, they have claims regarding human rights. For the Americans, at least under Biden, it was almost one thing: Saudi Arabia, of course, other Arab countries. But with regard to Ukraine, human rights do not sound at all. Although laws have been adopted in Ukraine, it is the only country in the world where laws have been adopted prohibiting one of the official languages of the UN in all spheres. The keeper of the charter is also silent. He is the Secretary General, which I have repeatedly talked about with him. But this is a separate topic of the Secretary. He has been privatized to a large extent in all key areas, almost all. There are citizens of NATO countries, and they are not shy about belonging to NATO contrary to Article sought and the UN Charter, which require they should not receive instructions from any government and be impartial. But continuing in relations with the West at the beginning of the 2000s, we were also interested. And President Putin, he drew a line and made sure that we became full members of the Group of 8, but in other areas that we formed to work with the West, and this is first of all, well, of course, the OSCE. It has always existed, but in addition to this Russian NATO Council, which at that time when it was created and began to function actively, there were dozens of joint projects in the fight against terrorism, cooperation in Afghanistan, and much more. And, of course, it was the U format of Russia. It is a unique format. Summits were held twice a year. The U did not have such a thing with anyone. There were more than 24 different mechanisms at the level of foreign policy and departmental leaders, at the level of economic institutions, ministries, transport, energy, humanitarian. For common spaces from Lisbon to Vladivostok, summits were held, including in Khabarovsk, where Europeans arrived. There was such a head of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, who came, went along the embankment in Khabarovsk. Admired. How so? Here we flew for 12 hours, and this is still Europe. So there were all such impressions that there are chances to move forward. At the same time, at that moment we are told, then you turned away from the West. No one has turned away from anyone, and we have simultaneously developed very good relations with the People's Republic of China, India, and Iran, helping them achieve a fair deal on the Iranian nuclear program. other Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, of course, I will not list everything, and Latin America. Even then, we began to act in the spirit of continuity from the point of view of Primakov's policy. Multipolarity means that you should be interested, of course, in promoting some of your needs and needs in the economy, in other areas, in security, but you are never closed to talking to any country in the world. Of course, this does not oblige anyone to anything, but very often just ordinary contacts. They allow us to reveal new directions of mutually beneficial cooperation. This fully complies with the UN Charter. I have already referred to it, and do not get tired of referring to it, because many people say, let's write something new for the era of multipolarity. The Charter, it is for the era of multipolarity. It contains the key phrase, the United Nations is based on the sovereign equality of states. So there's no need to invent anything. And all the other principles, and human rights, which I have already mentioned, and the right of a nation to self-determination. The right of a nation to self-determination. It was at the heart of the decolonization process, which came 15 years after the creation of the UN. It was then that the African peoples had already gained strength, and they clearly had an understanding that the colonizers in London, Paris, Brussels, Madrid, Lisbon did not reflect their interests, and did not represent the population of the territories they formerly led.
Лиссабоне не отражают их интересов и не представляют население тех территорий, которыми они формально руководили.
By the way, this principle was fixed after decolonization in 1970. Negotiations were prepared for a long time. They reasoned what was more important, territorial integrity, or the right of a nation to self-determination. And in 1970, we came to the conclusion, adopted a detailed declaration on all the principles of the UN Charter, how they are interconnected. And in terms of territorial integrity and the right of a nation to self-determination, we wrote down by consensus, at the highest level unanimously, that everyone should respect the territorial integrity of those states that respect the principle of the right of a nation to self-determination. And because of this, they have a government representing the entire population living in a given territory.
Имеют правительство, представляющее все население, живущее на данной территории.
As the colonialists did not represent the population of their colonies in 1960, and therefore this principle has fallen into disrepair. So it is in Ukraine, as a matter of fact. After the coup, the Poroshenko regime, and then the Zelensky regime, which immediately after the coup said, we will cancel the status of the Russian language of those who did not accept the results of the coup, declared terrorists. And in the end, since the 19th year, a series of laws have been going on, exterminating the Russian language in all spheres. But how can we say that this, I don't know what to call it, is a group of putschists? So let's say that it represents the interests of the population of Donbass, Novorossiya, and Ukraine even more so. Therefore, the Charter should not be touched. It is absolutely modern. It is only necessary to respect and fulfill it. And not to say that when Kosovo declared independence without any referendum, oh, this is the right to self-determination. And when Crimea held a referendum, transparent, with the participation of hundreds of European observers, parliamentarians, public figures. This already means a violation of the principle of territorial integrity of Ukraine. Duplicity, cynicism, hypocrisy. Unfortunately, this is what we have to deal with. And so, concluding the review of that period, we were embedded, I emphasize once again, not ignoring all the other eastern and southern directions of our policy, but we were embedded in a number of mechanisms of relations with the West, as with no other group of countries.
как ни с какой другой группой стран.
with NATO, with the European Union, the Eight. At that time, our foreign policy had, once again, the most extensive mechanisms of cooperation. There were bilateral commissions in other areas. We had, and still have, an annual meeting with the ASEAN pop stars. But there were no such structured, government-implemented mechanisms with anyone.
Ну, просто внедренных вплоть правительственных механизмов такого не было ни с кем.
And all of this was sacrificed overnight to the fact that we refused to accept the coup in Ukraine, that the West had been preparing for a long time in order to make this country a springboard for creating military threats to us, dragging it into NATO, but also much, much more. We weren't blind. In the 27th year, the president warned in Munich, guys, we are working with you both with NATO, with the European Union, and with the Seven, already being a member of the Eight in the near future. But do not make us naive and take us for those who do not understand anything and do not see anything. If we are equal, then let's work equally. It's nobody. We continued after that, and Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin very patiently explained to each country, partner from the Western camp, at numerous meetings, what he meant when he spoke in Munich, if someone there did not understand something. And until the very last moment, we also gave them a chance not to bring matters to a heated conflict when in December of the 21st year, we said, you are blurting out the Minsk agreements, creating threats to our security. Let's sign a treaty on European security, where this security will be ensured without any involvement of anyone in your NATO. We were ignored. I myself met back in January of the 22nd year with Blinken. He said, no, we can only. It's none of your business about NATO, and we can only promise you that the number of medium-range missiles that we will deploy in Ukraine will be limited in a certain way. That's it. And the same hypocrisy, the same impunity, the same exclusivity, superhuman, I would say so. And that's what it all led to. It's not for nothing that the president, speaking at one of his major events last year, said that it would never be the same as it was before February of the 22nd year. That is, he hoped until February, probably already realizing the futility of these hopes. But he gave them a chance until the very last. But sit down at the table, let's agree on security, including the security of Ukraine, but in such a way that measures to ensure this security do not undermine our security. It was all being solved. And now many politicians, former members of the government, public figures with a hindsight, that is, they also have something in common with a Russian peasant somewhere who is strong with a hindsight, say that they should have done differently. But it turned out as it turned out. Now our goals are clear, our tasks are defined, as they used to say back in the Soviet Union.
They spoke for the work of a comrade then. And please tell me, by the way, speaking of the 22nd year, you had long negotiations with Blinken, indeed. Everyone remembers this. But for yourself, let's say, when you realized at what stage that it would not be possible to agree, how it was decided that it was time to start a special military operation. Another month has passed between your negotiations with Blinken.
Well, probably about a month. You know, I was hoping that reason, common sense, and pride would prevail after all. Not only plans to financially involve Ukraine in NATO, to create bases in the Crimea, on the Sea of Azov.
в Крыму, на Азовском море.
These were all plans. But in addition to this geopolitical plan, pride played an even greater role there. How so? They tell us not to, and do we agree, or what? I'm not exaggerating now. This, in the nude, is what they were guided by. And it's sad. This is not common sense. It's not for nothing that Trump now says all the time regarding any conflict, considering the position in America. He should have common sense. What common sense is it to give hundreds of billions to Ukraine, which is losing? The regime already does not have broad support, which will probably just lose. Let Europe, if they want, do it, and Washington's common sense dictates to step aside. Yes, we will be ready to help there, to conclude some economic agreements, but we have given enough weapons. And then, after all, there was such ideologization, and pride played a significant role in those tragic events. Events that the West ran into.
Гордыня сыграла в тех трагических событиях, на которые Запад нарвался.
And if we talk about the current time, we remember that our president said that the ball is on their side. And for many, after all, Iriev was a big surprise. What kind of preliminary work did you do, and when did you start it so that these negotiations would take place?
There was no preliminary work. The presidents called on Trump's initiative, so the ball that Putin threw to him in the 18th year in Geneva, in my opinion, at a press conference after the World Cup, and here is the ball that was an official FIFA ball, thrown at a press conference. Trump caught it, twisted it, threw it to members of his delegation who were sitting in front of them. And we all assumed that it wasn't Trump, of course, who cut off relations, but Biden, but this is one country. And Trump was well aware of this and called himself. Before that he sent his close advisor here for a conversation. Literally on the eve of a very detailed one. And then during a telephone conversation we agreed on his suggestion to meet in Istanbul.
Перед этим направил сюда своего близкого советника для разговора, буквально накануне, очень подробного. И затем в ходе телефонного разговора договорились по его же предложению встречаться в Стамбуле.
We flew there, in my opinion, 3 days after the phone conversation, so there was no preparation. Well, I mean two-sided. Of course, each team was preparing, and we had a normal conversation in the foreign ministry. They had a normal conversation in the State Department of two completely normal delegations. And it's amazing that this normality was perceived as a sensation, which means that our Western partners during Biden's cadence managed to bring world public opinion to such a state that it perceives a normal conversation as something out of the ordinary. We will never think the same way on every issue of world politics. And we recognized this in Riyadh, and the Americans recognized it. They themselves, in fact, said it. But where we see a coincidence of interests, well, common sense suggests that it is stupid not to use a coincidence of interests in order to translate this coincidence into some practical matters and get mutually beneficial results. And where interests do not coincide. Mark Rubio said that too. Where interests do not coincide, it is the responsibility of the responsible powers to prevent this non-coincidence from degenerating into confrontation. This is absolutely our position. By the way, this is also the format in which relations between the United States and China are being built. They have a huge number of disagreements. The Americans announce a lot of sanctions against China in order to suppress a competitor, not so much as against us. But also the Americans, by the way, the Europeans too, electric cars, 100% duties. Just unscrupulous competition. But I'm going back to the relationship model. Despite all these disagreements, despite the fact that periodically the top leaders of the United States, China, and ministers accuse the other side of some illegal actions, but above all in the economic sphere, but politics and security also sound there. Read this as Chinese ministers talk about the plans of the West in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea. This is a very sharp counteraction, and I understand the Chinese comrades when the West says, we all adhere to the one China policy, which means that China is one, and Taiwan, part of it. But having said that they are for the one China policy, they all say, but the status quo cannot be touched. And what is the status quo? It is an independent Taiwan. Therefore, there is a lot of guile here, and it is not for nothing that are representative of, in my opinion. The Chinese Ministry of Defense recently said that we are firmly in favor of a peaceful settlement. But we do not exclude the use of military force if we are led by the nose. Something like this. But with all this, the dialogue between Beijing and Washington has never been interrupted. And exactly such a model, I believe, should be in relations between any two states, especially between Russia and the United States, which can again find overlapping interests and do a lot of mutually beneficial things, and, on the other hand, they are obliged not to lead to war in case of a discrepancy of interests.
And if we talk about the United States, remembering how many secretaries of state
And the Secretary of State.
and the Secretary of State. All right, let there be secretaries of state. They would be offended. It's not politically correct, probably from their point of view.
Well, they don't have such grammatical norms as we do, but 3 secretaries of state. But isn't it a shame for a woman to be called in the masculine gender? Secretary of State, it's a masculine gender.
Well, there is such a subtle nuance here. When?
We just have a secretary from our history.
This is different.
This image is a little different. Well, all right.
Maybe more pleasant than the Secretary of State.
The head of the State Department.
So, how does it feel for you to maintain a dialogue with these constantly changing faces, despite the fact that the general trend of United States policy in our direction turns out to be approximately the same all the time, and the faces are different? How are you with them specifically?
The faces are different because we have already said that even when Trump was first elected, many politicians fell into euphoria. And now they are also falling into euphoria. The United States still has the same goal, to be the first country in the world. It's just that Biden, under Obama, in general, under the Democrats, they tried to do this, subjugating everything and everyone, paying for this support as they pay for NATO, as they paid for Japan and South Korea, creating such outposts with NATO participation, with nuclear components. Trump, he's a pragmatist. That's his slogan, common sense. He, of course, means and already sees it all, the transition to a different way of doing things, but the goal is still a magician. Make America great and gain. Now she has a new cap. Everything that Trump promised, he did. You understand, this gives such a lively character, the human nature of politics, dehumanizes all the bureaucratic schemes that we are used to. That's why it's interesting with him. His team and Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz are absolutely sane people. In every sense of the word, They talk based on the fact that, well, they don't command us, and we don't command them.
Не командуют они нами, и мы ими не командуем.
Just two.
Два
Two serious countries sat down to talk about where they had something wrong and what their predecessor had broken in 4 years, destroying all channels of contact without exception and introducing a number of sanctions, followed by the expulsion of American companies that had suffered losses of hundreds of billions of dollars.
за которыми последовало изгнание американских компаний, которые понесли убытки в сотни миллиардов долларов.
Therefore, the secretaries of state change. They also think, how is it I came or I came for 2 years, and it's all sitting there. It's about me. That's probably what they say. But I had a normal working relationship with all of Marco Rubio's predecessors, and, rather, with all of Blinken's predecessors.
Нормальные рабочие отношения.
It was from Rice's scandal with Hillary Clinton, with Madeleine Albright.
С Кондолизой Райс, с Хиллари Клинтон, с Мадлен Олбрайт.
She became Secretary of State before I became minister, but we worked very closely together. She passed away not so long ago. I sent condolences to her family. I had a great professional relationship with John Kerry, and in a human way.
Прекрасные отношения, да и по-человечески.
Until recently, we also exchanged texts with him, as well as with some others, with some of my former colleagues. But now it's a thing of the past.
Бывшими моими коллегами. Ну, сейчас уже дело прошлое.
Some of them, let's say, are not John Kerry. Another former colleague of mine sent condolences in connection with the terrorist attack in Crocus City Hall, but added, just without reporting it publicly.
Но добавил, только не сообщая об этом публично.
This is what Biden and this whole European, Brussels, unelected bureaucracy have brought to.
Брюссельская, никем не избираемая бюрократия.
Scandalous Rice, we still participated, when never now there is still a tradition of meeting, but a session with our partners. And the USA, China, Japan, India, Australia, Russia. Such meetings of foreign ministers take place once a year, and there was a tradition until recently, but it is. With COVID, she broke off when each delegation came up with some number for a gala dinner. We have been writing cabbage rolls all the time. This is another tradition laid by Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov, who a year before mine, 3 years before my return, together with Madeleine Albright, put a cabbage patch on the plot of West Side Story. He played a male character. Madeleine sang for a female one. You know, there was, of course, some kind of familiarity in this, maybe even to a certain extent, but it then rallied. Another thing is that such a warm atmosphere of communication, it did not help to overcome the most important deep contradiction, which was that it was unacceptable for us to constantly move NATO to the east. But nevertheless, we played the scandalous Rice Cabbage our delegation, and she played from the Americans on the piano. I still have photos. We are standing with her, and a big advertisement is like this. She is sitting at the piano. There were very useful, interesting, honest conversations, although they did not agree on everything, and so inspired each other. It's the same with Hillary Clinton, but there wasn't this frenzy that we saw, I won't name it by name, in the eyes of the leading foreign policy members of the Biden administration.
Вот этого остервенения, которое мы видели, не буду называть по именам, в глазах ведущих внешнеполитических членов администрации Байдена.
And with John Kerry, we probably set records. One of our colleagues looked at the statistics, and if we count meetings and telephone conversations, we were 59 or 60 in a year, some year. And, by the way, we achieved a lot of things, including preventing a catastrophe in Syria, when in 2000, on behalf of Obama and Putin, we agreed on Syria's accession to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and the destruction of stocks of these weapons, which was done, for which this organization received the Nobel Peace Prize. And a year later, the West began to say that Assad had not done something there, although the whole West voted that the issue was closed. This is dishonesty. Attempts to cheat all the time, of course, it does not cause anything but regret, at least.
But this has been going on, apparently, for quite a long time, not to say the whole post-war history, because if you look again, at the time of your work at the UN, when you were in a constructive dialogue, signed joint documents with the American side, and they violated these agreements, and what was literally stated there in a matter of months, as it was with Kosovo, as it was with Iraq, with the same thing.
С Kosovo, как это было с Ираком, с тем же самым.
A month before Colin Powell's speech, there was also your joint document with the US representative on the need to settle the dialogue and so on. How did you react to such things?
You know, this has already become a habit, and you are absolutely right. This attempt to cheat everyone continues, to present his position as the only true one. And even when I say, don't pin Powell, and we also worked very closely with him. And I am sure that he absolutely did not know what was in the test tube, what kind of white pie it was, that he was shaking in the Security Council. I say that everything is Saddam Hussein is not a tenant. He was simply framed by the CIA, but I don't want to be anti-European, so I will say. But the current situation confirms the idea that many historians state, namely that the last 500 years, when the West was formed more or less in the form in which it has reached our days, well, of course, with by some changes there. All these 500 years, all the tragedies of the world were born in Europe, or thanks to European politics.
В том виде, в котором он дошел до наших дней, ну, естественно, с какими-то там изменениями, вот эти все 500 лет, да, все трагедии мира зарождались в Европе или благодаря европейской политике.
Colonization, wars, Crusaders, Crimean War, Napoleon, World War I, Hitler.
Крымская война, Наполеон, Первая мировая, Гитлер.
And if you look at history in retrospect, the Americans did not play any such inflammatory, let alone incendiary role. And now, after this Biden term, people have come who want common sense leadership, who speak directly. We want to finish today. We want peace. And who now demands the continuation of the banquet in the form of war? Europe. The Danish Prime Minister said, you saw it, right? For Ukraine, the world is worse than war now. Starmer, who went after Macron to persuade Trump that it was not necessary to end this story so quickly, and at the same time boasted that this year Britain was making its largest contribution in the form of weapons to Ukraine, that is, directly contradicting Trump and declaring that we would pump up. Macron is running around with some, and Starmer too. Now we are talking about peacekeepers. We are training so many thousands. we will provide air cover for these peacekeepers. But this is also arrogance because, first of all, no one asks us, but Trump understands everything. Trump said it's too early to say when there will be a settlement. You can discuss this issue, but you will need the consent of the parties. He behaves correctly. And these guys are just like this plan of peacekeepers in Ukraine. This is a continuation of the Kiev regime's instigation to go to war against us, just as they trampled on the Minsk agreements, which their co-authors admitted quite recently our Western neighbor was not going to fulfill. Just as they brought Poroshenko and then Zelensky to power in the form of weapons on their bayonets, as they urged Zelensky to turn 180 degrees, although maybe Annalena Baerbock would have regarded it as 360. No, but he turned around 180, and from a man who came to power, on the slogans of the world, on the slogans, "Leave you alone," from the Russian language. This is our common language, our common culture, it's all there on the internet. And in 6 months, he turned into a pure Nazi. And, as our president correctly said, a traitor to the Jewish people. And just like now, just as they have brought him to power with bayonets and are pushing him forward, they now also want to prop him up with their bayonets in the form of peacekeeping units. But it will mean that the root causes will not disappear anywhere. Because when we ask these thinkers, what will happen to this part that you will take control of hypothetically? Well, nothing. Ukraine will remain there. And I asked one friend, I say, will the Russian language be banned there? He didn't say anything. They can't pronounce the word condemnation of what didn't happen. No other language has been subjected to such aggression. But imagine if French or German were banned in Switzerland, or even better, English would be banned in Ireland. Now the Irish want to define themselves a little bit there. So they tried to ban English. Now the whole UN would be shaking therefore all its columns, demanding that this Ireland be condemned. And here you can. So that's it? You speak to their eyes, they don't answer anything. This is exactly the same as me. It will soon be 3 years, publicly at a meeting, and meeting with the press. I ask you to help us get at least some information on the Butch, the tragedy in which was used to impose sanctions on us. And when I say, well, guys, these scenes were shown by the BBC 2 days after there was no longer any of our military. So we're only asking for one thing now. I'm already desperate for something more. You can see a list of those people whose corpses you showed on the BBC channel. I even asked the UN Secretary General about this publicly at a meeting of the Security Council, and more than once. Also, the last time I was in New York for a session of the General Assembly, I had a final press conference. The whole world press was there. There were 70. And I said to them, guys, you're journalists. Aren't you interested in professionally finding out what happened there? So we requested from the UN Human Rights Office, they have missions in Ukraine there, inside this office, which were created neither by consensus nor consulted with anyone, officially requested information about the names of those people who were already shown there in a dead form. There is no reaction at all. And the journalists, me too, I kind of shamed them or something. Even then it was 2.5 years after this tragedy, when this trouble was shown on the screens of the BBC. and in social networks. It was a news explosion. 3 days, and it's all gone. I say, did they tell you that you need to be quieter? I know half of them there well, they have been working there for a long time. But can't journalists send a journalistic request to the same Ukrainians? Nobody does anything. The team passed everything.
Well, they may have sent, they didn't get any answers. They were told and calmed down.
Maybe.
But here's what's paradoxical. For a very long time, we probably assumed with Georgia, we believed that Georgia was a US project. That's what Ukraine was a US project. But now it feels like the picture is changing. You have already mentioned the old world, which is interested in this. So how is it really? Is the United States acting as a puppet of Europe and not vice versa?
It's hard for me to guess here. No, of course, when Georgia and Ukraine were mentioned in the 2008 year at the NATO summit in Bucharest, there was also a Russian NATO summit during which Putin said, well, why did you accept this phrase? That Georgia and Ukraine will be in NATO. And they answered, Merkel answered him, oh, you know, we fought for this phrase, because it only indicates the goal. It does not imply the start of accession negotiations. It's such naivety. It was in April, in my opinion, at the farm, and already in June, Condoleezza Rice went to Georgia and called. And then what happened happened. No, the Americans were the ringleaders, but this, you know, began after the Soviet Union collapsed. They decided that the post-war world order was no longer based on the consent of the great powers, but on Washington's decisions. It was a gross mistake. The apotheosis of this line, it reached the apotheosis of politics. This is the policy of the United States, reached under the Democrats, when the ultra-neoliberals began to act using the methods of color revolutions, including planning them for Georgia, for Ukraine in the 2008 year. So here it is. No, the US is not running errands, of course. It's just that Trump doesn't need it now. He wants to have influence where there is benefit for America. Isn't that normal? In my opinion, it's fine.
Absolutely fine. Remembering the 2008 year, one can note a rather interesting thing. You are always extremely correct in your statements. You are a model of diplomatic language. If you look at the texts of your speeches, there was a gradation in the 2008 year. You remained, of course, just as correct, but your wording to our foreign partners, as it was then customary to say, became much more harsh. Was it a conscious decision, or a deliberate transition to their language, or an internal one?
No, well, you know, after all, professionals in diplomacy, here I am, at least I don't make a decision. Here, now I'm going to say something rougher here. I say what I think, not as a person who cares about the concept of honor, pride, conscience, as a diplomat. And in principle, it's not so far from each other, because we have, in general, moral diplomacy, I think. And when they say that foreign policy, this is cynicism, this is deception, well, probably we need to be cunning somewhere. Yes, it happens. But I prefer to be honest. And Putin, he is definitely a supporter of honest, direct diplomacy. This is how he talks and has talked. and is ready to talk to everyone, including Western countries, which are now accusing him of all mortal sins, the same Macrons, Scholz.
And in this respect, do the diplomatic, let's say, Russian, and, let's say, Chinese schools coincide? Or are we closer to the West in the manner of introducing dialogue?
Well, it's not my place to comment on the Chinese Western diplomatic school, except for one thing. The Chinese diplomatic school has never even allowed the thought of not having a conversation with any country, especially with its neighbor, and closing the door in relations. Never. And our neighbor in the form of the West, Europe, has done just that. And this, of course, is not diplomacy at all. And our diplomacy has always proceeded from our interests, and these interests consist in what is written in the foreign policy concept, ensuring the most favorable external conditions in order to guarantee the security of the country, opportunities for its socio-economic development, and the growth of the welfare of citizens. It would seem such a banal thing, but that's the way it is. And if we understand that some country or bloc, like NATO or the European Union, pose threats to us, of course, we must do everything to avert these threats, as we tried to do for many years after the coup in Ukraine in the 2014 year. Until February of the 22nd year, we tried to do exactly this, to avert the threat by diplomatic means. They refused to recognize our legitimate interests. So diplomacy is about talking and being able to hear.
And you? Yes, I understand. They probably make signals to you, but nevertheless, during your entire diplomatic journey, have you ever had the feeling that you are losing control of the situation?
I can't do that now. Well, probably, when the Americans began, their European satellites began to bomb Belgrade in the 99th year. Yes, of course. But this, in general, we were ready for this, because they did not hide their plans, without any appeal to the Security Council to do it. It's not a loss of control. You see, we didn't control it anyway. This situation, it was a planned operation. Just like when they started bombing Iraq under false pretenses, as they later admitted. Well, like water from a goose. That's why it's better not to set impossible tasks in situations like this, when you did everything to prevent aggression, in this case, as it was in Iraq and Serbia. But then we recouped a little when they themselves ran to the Security Council and said, "It's been 72 days, I don't remember how many. The war in Yugoslavia, help." Then we helped to draw up a peace treaty. And when they drew up a peace treaty, they calmed down, the war ended. And now the peace agreements that were concluded in that resolution of 99th year, including the recognition that Kosovo. This is Serbia, that in Kosovo Serbs have the right to have law enforcement agencies, police, and this does not happen. 26 years have passed, and today I will have contacts with my Serbian colleagues. They are trying to force them to simply swallow humiliation and recognize the independence of Kosovo. And why? But because the West announced it in 2008 year, so let's listen. So is life like it? Or rather, diplomacy is like life. It's not easy, but you have to live and work.